Chapter 32, A Slipped Collar. Be still and know that I am God. Text for Judge Wheeler's funeral sermon, in which the church has the last word. Sayward sat in Porteous's bedroom upstairs, waiting for the funeral to start. Sooth, with her big family to get ready, had just come in the courtroom, but Libby, with only a man to fetch, hadn't showed up yet. "Now don't be hard on her, Mamma," Massey said. "It's all right to be a little late." But not for your father's funeral, Sayward thought, although she said nothing. She just sat tightly in her strong basque, and the voluminous folds of her black silk. If Libby and Harry were late, they were late, but when it came to the last thing they could do for Porteous, she would rather they were on time. The air seemed close in here. The bed stood piled with family wraps. Chairs from neighboring houses crowded the floor. Sayward had a little trouble catching her breath, but none of the others said anything, so she kept still. Out of the window she could see the overflow of folks in the front yard. She wished Porteous could know the big turnout for his funeral. Resolve had wanted it in a church. So did Deasia and the others, and Dr. Shotwell had supported them, but Sayward had stood firm. Porteous never went to church when he could help himself, and she wouldn't play such a trick on him as take him there now when he couldn't. She would make him out no hypocrite or turncoat at the last minute. Whatever faults he had, they were not those. Some of the rogues and knaves out there in the cold of the yard looked like they would rather stay out anyway. It was nice of them to pay their last respects to Judge Wheeler, and they were welcome to come in the warm if they wanted, but a few of them might not feel at home sitting down with pious, God-fearing folks. Porteous had lent a hand to so many scalawags in his time, jailbirds, drunkards, and bad women. Hardly ever would he give to a good cause. "That's a fine and noble charity," he used to say. "I wouldn't give it a penny. I give only to the devil's ken. The sinners nobody else will help. Even the door of heaven is closed against them." A good many of those he helped or their friends had come to the funeral. Now here were Libby and Harry saying something about a patient who made them late, and there was Dr. Shotwell's voice from downstairs, coming right on behind like a peddler's pack. It was plain that this was what he had been waiting for. His voice rang out, brisk as an auctioneer's, through the house. The family, mourners, and the rest might be stricken with grief and fright before the specter of death, but he wasn't. Death was every day to him. Disposing of it was his trade. His words came matter-of-fact like this was an old story to him, to be put through without waste of time, on corners and edges. All the sweat and fire would be saved for the funeral sermon, to crown the saint and punish the sinner, and put the fear of God and of hell in all who heard him. Sayward had to get hold of herself once or twice. It wasn't easy to sit calm and hear yourself parted forever from the man you lived with for going on 45 years and the father of your children. Nor would she have just bad said about him at his funeral when he lay helpless and silent in his box and couldn't rise up to defend himself. That's why she had taken Dr. Shotwell into Porteus's library last night, closed the door, and come right out with where she stood. What Porteus believed, she said, was his and the Lord's business, and what end he came to, the Lord would judge, and the Lord would know what to judge from. Porteus had made some mistakes in his time. He was no saint, but she had lived with him long enough to know a lot of decent things about him, and if the bad would be played up more than the good, she would have no funeral sermon said over him at all. To herself, she added that nobody looked more peaceful than Porteus, lying there in his box. If he had gone to a bad place, he certainly gave no sign of it. She had to admit Dr. Shotwell did an honest job. He didn't whitewash, but he said the bad first, and gave it no more talking about than it deserved. Then he started on the good. Sooth was the first to sob. The other girls followed. When the choir sang "The River Between," Sayward saw even Resolve and Chauncey wipe their eyes. Sayward tried to, too. It didn't look right, she felt, sitting there like a dry stone in the run. Those crowded in the upstairs hall could look right in and reckon she still held against Porteus what he had done to her 30 years ago. But she couldn't help it. If she couldn't cry, she couldn't. Tears had never come to her easy, not even when her mother went, coughing up her heart's blood, or when little Sully spoke the last time with her blackened lips, looking up at her with no lashes on her eyes, begging her not to scold her that she had burned herself. Even when the news came about Gordon at last, how he had paid back the life he took, giving his own for his country, enduring wounds to die of fever and be buried in some heathen place with a Mexican name 2,000 miles from his Ohio home, she couldn't give way and melt the cruel knot twisted inside of her. If she hadn't then, how could she cry for Porteus now? He had been luckier than most, going quick, 1 hour on the bench, and the next being carried home a corpse. She hoped it might be that way with her when her time came, still in harness and all over in a hurry. But whatever way it came, she would have to take it. The funeral service seemed mighty long. It comforted her a little to count it in her mind, the service for Gordon too, who didn't have much of any. Later she stood at the grave, leaning forward like a tree on the river bank, with some of its roots washed out. When she turned away, she told herself that much was behind her now. She would have to leave the dead with the Lord and think about the living. There was Chauncey getting into the carriage behind her, looking like he needed clothes and rations. He had fallen off since she saw him last, For months she had heard rumors that his lady, Miss Ray, had fitted to some other flower patch and left him with the paper. Business was shaky. The stores wouldn't advertise any more in what they called a copperhead paper. Creditors were pushing him. Now, what could Chauncey do when he had no paper to sound out his views in? Sayward just felt thankful that she could feed him today at the funeral dinner. This would be the first time he sat down to a meal in his mammy's house since he pulled up stakes and left. Wasn't it a pity that it took the death of your father to fetch you home to your mother's table? Even so, it was uncommon that he stayed long enough to eat. Sayward reckoned she knew what he waited for. It was to hear how much his father left him. The girls tried to drag her away, but she had to see that folks at the second and third tables got enough to eat. Resolve called her twice before she would come to the library. The rest of the family was already inside. Sure enough, there was Chauncey, sitting like he didn't care, but none of them had bigger ears. Already his face looked filled out, since he had a square meal inside of him. If only she had him home for a while, she could plump him up and put roses in his cheeks. She would ask him today, wouldn't he stay and keep her company, but she had no notion he would agree. He would say he had to go back to Cincinnati. That was the way it went. And here she would be all alone in a big house, with no one to cook for but an old woman who hardly got hungry anymore, save for a crust of bread and a cup of tea. Now wasn't it a shame that Porteous didn't leave Chauncey an inheritance so he could keep on with his paper? Sooth could have used something too, with her big family, even in his will. Porteous had to be himself and leave his children their youth, their wit, and their sense of humor, as he called it. He always had to have his little joke. It was true he had given his children their wit and some of their being able to laugh, but he hadn't had much to do with their youth. Some of them weren't even young anymore. There was Resolve, high in his 40s. Porteous might have left Resolve his law books, but then he would have had to match that gift to the others. It was better, he must have reckoned, to bestow on his widow what he had to by law anyway. The rest could go to his fund for rogues and sinners. Oh, his heirs looked at each other with hard eyes when Resolve laid down the will. Massey and Libby spit out what they thought, but Chauncey acted like when, as a small boy, he would get hurt easy and hide in the loft. One minute he was here, and the next Sayward couldn't find him. "Chauncey, did you see Chauncey? I want to talk to him," she called, going about the house, but Chauncey had left neither hat nor word behind him. One by one, friends and family followed. Resolve had an important meeting. Sooth and Massey had to get their young ones to bed. Libby said she ought to be at home now for the evening patience. The members of bar and bench had long since paid their respects and taken leave. The Morrisons, the Sutphens, the Quitmans, and the rest had drifted off. A few stayed on, George Holcomb and Will Beagle among them. George wanted to hear about Huldah, and likely Will hated to go back to his lonely house after a funeral fetched up in his mind about Jenny. Sayward was glad to have him stay. Will was one of the oldest friends she had left, the only brother-in-law she owned, save for Sully's Indian man. It was a pity Jenny couldn't have given Will some young ones in her time. They would be a comfort to him now in his old age. Every time the door shut, the house felt a little lonelier. In the end, it looked mighty empty with just her and Deesia. She was thankful Deesia didn't have to go back to her teaching at the ladies' seminary till Sunday. "Now, Deesia, you better go to bed," she said. She would come soon, her own self, she promised. But in her heart she felt grateful for the few things that neighbors and friends had left undone, small things that only the woman of the house could attend to, redding up here and straightening out there and putting back yonder. When she did climb the stairs, it wasn't to sleep. God knows she had been up enough the last few days to drop off the minute her head hit the bolster, and yet her eyes didn't want to shut tonight, or her body let go to such a point where she wouldn't know where she was at. The big house stood mighty still around her. Once upon a time, on nights like this, it was filled with sleeping, restless, snoring young life, charging up energy to be spent violently on the morrow. One by one they had cleared out, taking something out of the house with them, and now you could tell that Porteous was gone too. That certain living power of his presence was missing from the rooms. That feel and flavor she had had of him from the day Will Beagle had told her how he had caught the Bay State solitary tramping up and down outside his cabin, made of buckeye logs, reciting Latin and Greek or some other dead language. She could see Porteous now as he was then, a bush nipple and no mistake, standing up to marry her in his ruffled linen shirt, pied with doe-skin patches, and his homemade buckskin breeches, shrunk and dried and clapping like clapboards when he walked. And she could see him as he was these last years, the eminent Judge Wheeler, in his long coat and broad-cloth breeches, starting for court on a weekday. Now on the Sabbath he would go out in the oldest suit he had, with his stick across the back of his shoulders. He did it on purpose, she always thought, setting out at that hour with his walking stick and old clothes, so he would pass Christian folk dressed in their Sunday best, on their way to church. He liked to devil them, as he did her when he came to the kitchen for cake stuff. "Any gingerbread, my love and my dove," he would say, and yet all the time she knew what he was after. He had no sweet tooth for her baking. No, he only wanted the gingerbread to set out for the mice, so they would spare his law books. Oh, sometimes he had been hard to put up with, and yet that was the very part of him she would have parted with last. His feeling for rogues, she always thought, came from his being part of one himself. He liked to take sly digs at folks, and none was so honest or sacred as to be spared. He would poke Willie fun at Resolve's mother-in-law's table by telling how he had, that day, seen the Morrison goat. It belonged to another and poorer set of Morrisons, so thin it followed the handbill man around and licked the flour paste off the put-up handbills, and when somebody's brandy tasted weak, he would say it reminded him of Ferry House whiskey. I never knew King Sam to buy but 1 barrel of it, he told. Every time he drew a gallon, he replaced it with a gallon of water. Even poor and simple country folk were not immune from Porteous's jokes. He liked to tell of the farmer who bought a wagon from the Tateville Wagon Works and then hung around waiting for the discount they promised him. "Why, I gave it to you," the manager said. "Oh, no, you didn't," the farmer said craftily. "I've been sitting here looking for it all this while, and I ain't seen a thing." He had no shame, and nothing fazed him. Hardly would she forget the time, long ago, she had got him to camp meeting, and the preacher, for something to say, called out in his sermon, "Where is that wine-bibber and agnostic who sits in high places?" "Here I am, sir," Porteous said cheerfully, standing up. It had shamed her so no end, and scared the preacher nearly out of his boots. The story went all over the county, but people had respected Porteous more than ever. Honest Judge Wheeler, they called him. He'd send himself to prison if he done any wrong. Favorite words and sayings of Porteous came back to Sayward's mind tonight. Never would he say Christmas, but at the time called Christmas. He would make common things sound noble, like when he called some good-for-nothing, that scurrilous and epithetical piece of rascality, or when he'd refer to Sayward's family's humble tramp west as their long and arduous exodus from the eastern states. A dead man was a man deprived of his life, a gentleman, a man of parts. If a guest praised the food on Sayward's table, Porteous would invariably agree and add slyly, as Fred Pynchon used to say, "Yes, it's good, what there is of it, and there's enough of it, such as there is." When Chauncey was still at home, and would lie abed late in the morning, Porteous used to call in stentorian tones up the back stairs, "Chauncey, don't you know that the great majority of people die in their beds? You could never get the best of him, even when he made a mistake, and you proved it." His eye would twinkle, and all he would admit was that old Wheeler household saying that Matthias Cottle first said, "I was just a-thinking, and if I hadn't been a-thinking, I wouldn't have thunk that way." He liked especially to tell stories against aristocrats and the gentry, like the one of the driver who said to the Lord, "Are you the man to take the carriage? If you are, I'm the gentleman to take you." But most of his stories were about the law. One they told about him so often that Sayward knew it by heart. At one time it was resolved he was supposed to be talking to, another time some other young lawyer. What do I do if the law is on my side, and justice against me? The apprentice lawyer was supposed to ask. Advocate the majesty of the law. They said. Porteous answered, Well, suppose justice is on my side, and the law against me. Advocate justice, though the heavens fall. They said. Porteous thundered, But what do I do if the law and justice are both against me? Oh, then saw the air and talk of glorious liberty for all men. Porteous told him. That story had gone far and wide among lawyers. She heard them telling it at the funeral table again today, along with the one about the tattered Bible Porteous had for years in his court. Thousands of witnesses and several judges had been sworn on it. Then one day somebody opened it and found it was a copy of Arabian Nights. Well, she better try closing her mind for a while. Sayward told herself she could lie here till New Year's Day if she wanted to, recollect all the things Porteous said and did. It must be getting toward morning. Not that it mattered any. A woman needed small sleep, and less pastime when she got old. The clock and calendar passed fast enough for you then. Chapter 33. The Witness Tree. Come from. Why, I didn't come from any place. I been here all the time. Old settler. Sayward was in her kitchen, supper eaten, what she had of it, the few dishes washed and put away. She had made it herself around 5 o'clock, as usual. Now she sat here, not doing anything, just thinking. It was singular how she had it in her head tonight, about Hugh McFall's Locust Post. Porteous used to tell of the time he was in Hugh's field, and Hugh laid his hand on a fresh cut and peeled post he had just put in. Porteous said, Hugh felt and patted that stick of wood like it was a colt. I just wish I could last as long as this post, he told Porteous. Hugh must have been falling then, or had second sight, for he was dead in the year. 20 years afterward, Porteous said he went in the field, a purpose, and found that post sound as the day Hugh had put it in. And now Porteous himself was dead and buried 8 years. She declared it didn't seem that long. Now what made her think this way? Oh yes, it was Hugh McFall and his Locust Post. But what made her think of that in the first place? Why, it was most dark already. She had seen a slew of winters in her time, and it still surprised her how early night came of a fall afternoon. She pulled herself up and made her way to the front of the house. Now what did she come in for? It must have been something, or she wouldn't be standing here with a candle lighted at the kitchen stove, a burning in her hand. Oh yes, how could she forget what she did every day at this time for nigh onto 30 years? The big hall lamp she lit blinded her for a minute. Now she had to watch out she didn't let it burn too high and smoke like she did last week. Going back to the kitchen, she dropped the candle. Well, it didn't matter so long as she hadn't set fire to anything. She didn't need the light. It felt good to pass from a lighted to an unlighted room and feel the darkness wash over and soothe her. She had always liked that, from the time Porteous built a second room to their cabin. Even since they had the big house, she liked to sit and rest a minute in the dim kitchen when her evening's work was done, taking notice of the pleasant glow and sounds of life coming from some other rooms up yonder in the front of the house. She went to the high narrow closet with the little doors behind the kitchen fireplace. There was no light, save what came down from the long hall, but she didn't need any. Her fingers could find what she wanted. When she was little, the touch of a clay pipe used to go through her like eating a persimmon. Now it felt like an old friend. Her unsteady hand cut plug in her palm, and her thumb pushed it in the bowl. When she had lighted it with a spill from the stove, she sat back in the rocker. Oh, this she knew, these last years, was why her father smoked. The small fire in the bowl warmed you, body and soul. The smoke drifted up like chimney smoke. A pipe, in truth, was a piece of household comfort you could carry with you far into the lonesome tracts of the deep woods. If only she could take off her shoes and stockings now, and have her feet free against the floor by the stove. The girls reckoned it unladylike, but she even liked the scent of sweat and tan bark leather from her shoes. She could crack their toe knuckles, but she never could. Some folks who wore their shoes all the time like she had to these years missed the good feel of grass and leaves, the bare toes a-working in earth or sand, but she better not do it now, not till she went to bed. Wasn't that the front door and somebody in the front hall? Sayward put the pipe back to its cup on the shelf behind the little door and went front. Yes, there was Libby, a few steps up the stairs. I was just going by, she said, as if her mother didn't know she came by here every day on purpose. What do you have it so dark for? I'll light the sitting-room lamp for you. A body gets tired being in the light all the time, her mother told her. Won't you take off your things? Libby waited till she had done her work with a spill from the mantel, lighted from the hall lamp chimney. Then her eyes critically examined her mother as she took off her cape and promptly slipped it back on again. It's cold in here. I don't see how you could stand it with only that knit thing around your shoulders. You ought to be in a warm house. How do you feel tonight? Her mother didn't answer, and Libby lifted her nose to sniff. It smells exactly like somebody was smoking in here. And when Sayward still kept mildly silent, why don't you ever want to tell how you feel, Mama? You just asked me last night or night before, her mother complained. I don't think about it till you ask me. We're concerned about you, Mama. You needn't fret so much. I can get along real good. We're thankful you can, but what if something would happen, and you all alone in this house? Then I reckon it would happen, Sayward said, resigned. I don't see how you can be so cold-blooded. Think what people would say about us, and think how we feel. We never know, night or day. It's better sometimes if you don't know, Sayward said shortly. That's foolish, Mama. If Harry knew in time, he could do something for you. He's your doctor. He knows more about you than anybody else, more than you do yourself. And he says you're not fit to be alone. I don't know what he says that for, Sayward said stoutly. He doesn't mean only your leg. He means the way you are lately. What way? Well, just the way people get when they get old. They ought to have somebody with them. They can't be trusted. You mean I'm getting queer, Sayward put to her. Well, not queerer than anybody else your age. People must expect it when they get up in years. They're forgetful. Take yourself. You don't remember things any more. I can remember as good as you, Miss Libby, her mother said sharply. Yes, right now, but not all the time, especially when you're alone. You eat things you shouldn't. You won't take your medication. You keep runaways in the house, no matter how big and black and dangerous they are. You cook their meals and give them money. They could knock you on the head so easy. Then you won't listen to your children. You won't come to live with any of us. You say we should come and live with you, but if anything happened, we'd have to move again, because the square's all business now, and getting worse every day. Even if we did come, we'd have to do everything like you said. We'd be living in your house, and you'd be the master. It wouldn't work, especially with the man of the family. Besides, you said yourself you'd rather be alone. If you'd only have a regular maid in the house, so there'd be somebody here with you all the time, it would be different. Why, there isn't a house in Americus half this size that doesn't have one maid or two, but all you'll have is just Mattie to clean a couple of times a week, and she's pretty near as old and feeble as you are. The house doesn't get upset with just one person in it, Sayward protested. It gets upset enough. Folks come in here all the time. If it isn't somebody to pay rent or interest, it's somebody trying to borrow or get you to donate. Or it's somebody who stayed with you once, and there were thousands of those. Or they knew Papa and Resolve when he was a governor. If it's mealtime, you cook their dinner or supper, and if it isn't, you give them cakes and whiskey. Or it's somebody who knew you when you were a girl. Folks that knew me when I was a girl are all gone, Libby, Sayward said. Well, you shouldn't have to lift a finger, Libby declared. Not with your bad leg and all your other ailments. You must remember you're an old lady mama. But I'm not dead yet, Libby, Sayward said mildly, and I like to have something to do my own self. Well, I should think there'd be other things for you to do than go out and pet those trees of yours in the side yard. Now don't get mad at me, Mama. You asked a while ago if you were getting queer, and that's one queer thing you do. Your neighbors over the water company say you go around to every one and pat it with your hand and look up at it and talk to it. Yes, they do. They claim you do it twice a day. They can't hear what you say. But after little Sooth stayed with you the last time, she said you give those trees good night and good morning. We told her not to dare breathe a word to anybody. We can't imagine how you would do such a thing. You used to tell us how you hated trees. Just what do you do it for, Mama? Sayward's face set, and she didn't answer. How could she explain that to Libby? She couldn't even explain it to herself. At her silence, Libby's face set too, studying it. Her mother could well believe that this was the child who folks said favored her the most. Sayward could see some of her stubbornness and resolve in her now. "Mama, there's no need deceiving you. We don't like to tell you some things, but you won't listen to us. Harry's told us for a long time to expect anything. It's not only your leg, although that's bad enough. The veins are clotted and abscessed, and if it isn't watched and dressed, it might turn into gangrene any day. But what he's worried most about is a stroke. One time he came in, and you couldn't talk to him right, he says. You've worked too hard ever since you were a little tyke. It's telling on you now, and something has to be done about it. We'd have gone ahead before, but we didn't want to disturb you too much before your picture's painted." Behind Libby, in one of the long looking-glasses that had come down from the Wheelers, Sayward could see herself, so that she thought was the face her family and the Pioneer Society wanted painted so they could show generations still to come how the first settler of Shawnee County looked. Libby was right when she said that she was getting up in years. The skin of her face had pulled together and worn away like old cloth when the nap is gone, and you can see only the warp. Criss-cross ridges ran across her cheeks, like on old trees and Indians. Her neck had shrunken mostly to up and down tendons. Now what made the top of her head slant away more than it used to? Her nose stood out plain enough, but her mouth pinched and drew down like she had seen on old folks in their coffins. Bitter at that bitterest of all things, death. She reckoned it was partly that her teeth were gone. Her hair had turned gray long ago, then white, and now to another color. It had that dirty yaller look she had seen on old women in her time. When she was younger, she thought those old women just had dirty hair, but now she knew better. She couldn't wash it out. Even soap she made her own self wouldn't take off the tarnish. Once she had been light-complected, but now her skin looked dark brown. It was the Indian in her, she told herself, only her blue eyes bellied it. They looked out at her straight and calm like always. "Do you hear me, Mama?" she heard Libby's voice say sharply. "Yes, I hear you," Sayward said, looking back to her again. "What I want to say is that this isn't something sudden. We've been facing it a long time. Ever since last winter, we've done nothing but talk about it. We wrote to Huldah and Kinsey. We talked to Deasia when she was home. We came to the conclusion we couldn't let you in the house another winter alone. Not in your condition with all the fires to keep up that you wouldn't be able to. We decided there was only one thing to do, and that was bring you to my house, where you could have care." "You mean winter next year?" Sayward asked. "No, I mean this year, in a week or two." Sayward sat silent, with a kind of shocked grief. "Your father and I built this house," she said at last. "I've lived here for over 30 years, and I wouldn't have it torn down for a store or something, not while I'm alive. We talked that over too. It's handy to the courthouse. Resolve said he could use it for his law offices, not the whole house, but he could rent the rest out. They wouldn't have to change a thing, and the furniture could be stored on the third floor. The other children mightn't like Resolve having the house, Sayward mentioned cautiously. We took that up with Huldah and Kenzie. They said it was all right. Did you take it up with Chauncey? We thought, what's the use talking to him? He's against everything and everybody, especially Resolve. But we did then, and he said so, too. It surprised us. After all, he's printed against Resolve. We don't understand who pays the money to keep up that terrible paper of his. It doesn't make any money. It isn't you, is it, Mama? Sayward sat there a moment with a cruel face. I haven't seen Chauncey but once since his father's funeral, and then I didn't have a chance to speak to him. Well, I didn't think you'd do a thing like that, give him more than you gave us. But I told the others the first chance I had I'd come right out and ask you. Sayward's mouth set like it used to years ago. I've always tried to be even-handed, Libby, she reminded sharply. But if one gets a lick more than another while I'm alive, the others will find it taken care of in the will. We know you want to be impartial, Mama, Libby said humbly. Just the same, it's mighty funny. But I didn't come here to talk about Chauncey. We wanted you to know about this so you could be ready, and we wouldn't have any trouble with you when the time came. She said a great deal more than that, explaining to her mother just how they had everything worked out, so it would be best for her. When finally she got up to go, Sayward wet her lips. Did Chauncey say right out you should move me, Libby? Why, yes, Mama. We asked him, and he said he hadn't a thing against it. Libby started for the hall. Now don't you dare get up. I can let myself out. For a wonder, Sayward obeyed. She heard the door close and Libby step outside. Even you, Chauncey. Then she said aloud. For a while she kept sitting there in a kind of stolid brooding. In her time she had looked forward to a good many things that came to pass, but never had she looked forward to outlasting her time. Where were those now she knew as a girl in the woods? Jenny and Asha, Will and Mary Harbison, George Roebuck, the Covenhovens, the McWhirters, and the Tulls, Jake Tench, the McFalls, and the Browns, the Morrisons, and the Sutvens, even Will Beagle. They were gone, all gone. More than once, as a girl, she hadn't seen a strange face in the woods from one month to the other, and yet all the time she had her pappy and her brother and sisters. But when your brother and sisters and then your man drop off one by one, when the friends and neighbors you grew up with are dead and buried, when all the folks you knew who lived and felt like you did are gone, lock, stock, and barrel, never to return, and you're the last of your generation, then you can drink a draught of loneliness you never drank before. She reckoned she knew now how one of those old butts in the deep woods felt when all its fellows were cut down and it was left standing alone and gaunt against the sky, with only whips and brush and those not worth the axe pushing up around it. The second-growth trees you saw today were mighty poor and spindly specimens, beside the giants she had known when first she came to this country. Those wild, shaggy, mossy, old-time butts would be out of place in Americus today, as would the shaggy, old-time folks she had known. Yes, and she was out of place, her own self, living her old life like she did in her day, taking care of herself at her age, and doing her own work, giving no thought if she lived or died. That's one reason why her children wanted her to move. Younger folks couldn't stand seeing her do it. It was too hard on their nerve strings. What gave folks nerve strings today and made them soft so they couldn't stand what folks could when she was young? Oh, she was no learned judge like Porteous, just an old woodsy woman who hadn't learned to read and write till her own young ones taught her. Her eyes were not so good any more, and her mind would lately forget, but she had her own notions. It had taken a wild and rough land to raise the big butts she saw when first she came here, and she reckoned it took a rough and hard life to breed the kind of folks she knew as a young woman. If you made it easy for folks, it seemed like their hardihood had to pay for it. Didn't she know which one of her young ones was it she had raised the softest, done the most for, coaxed and prayed along, saved from bad things, one time after the other? Wasn't it the same one that now could take life and his country the least, and wanted to change God's world over from top to bottom? It was the same with sick folks, say were noticed. Once they had been taken care of too long, they got to feeling the world ought to be changed and softened, centered toward themselves. But what in God's name did soft and weak folks want to make the whole world over like they were for? In her time in the woods, everybody she knew was egged on to be his own special self. He could live and think like he wanted to, and no two humans you met up with were alike. Each had his own particular beliefs and his reasons for owning to them. Folks were a joy to talk to then, for all were different. Even the simple-minded were so original in their notions, they either made you laugh or gave you pause. But folks in Americus today seemed mighty tiresome, and getting more so. If you saw one, you saw most. If you heard one talk, it's likely you heard the rest. They were cracked on living like everybody else, according to the fashion, and if you were so queer and outlandish as to go your own way and do what you liked, it bothered their nerve strings, so they were liable to lock you up in one of their newfangled asylums, or take you home where they could hold you down to their way of doing, like Libby wanted to. What was the world coming to, and what hearty pleasures folks today missed out of life? One bag of meal, her pap said, used to make a whole family rejoice. Now folks came ungrateful from the store, grumbling they had to carry such a heavy market basket. Was that the way this great new country of hers was going to go? The easier they made life, the weaker and sicker the race had to get. Once a majority of the men got weak and soft, what weak, harmful ways would they vote the country into then? Well, her pap's generation could get down on their knees and thank the Almighty they lived and died when they did. How would they ever have come and settled this wild country if they said to each other, "Ain't you afraid?" How would her pappy have fetched them the long way out here on foot if he'd kept asking all the time, "Are ye all right? How do ye feel? Do ye reckon ye can make it?" No, those old-time folks she knew were scared of nothing, or if they were, they didn't say so. They knew they ran bad risks moving into Indian country, but they had to die sometime. They might as well live as they pleased, and let others bury them when the time came. Now Libby's generation, it seemed, lived mostly to study and fret about ailing and dying. The knocker on the front door sounded. Who could that be? Likely some other fearful soul, to ask was she all right, and wasn't she afraid to stay in the house by herself, at her age, not knowing what might happen. She turned down the light. She didn't know as she wanted to listen to any more tales tonight of how some other bodies, living all alone, got sick or fell, and there they lay till strangers came in and found them. Rat-a-tat. Yes, it was some timid soul. Already he or she was getting discouraged, for that knock was not so hearty as the first time. What a difference it was when Alec came last year, or was it the year before? Anyway, she was sitting in the kitchen that time when the knocker sounded. She had had a run of callers all day. She had her pipe in her mouth and her shoes off taking her ease, and she thought she wouldn't go to the door. Then she heard the big brass knocker with the Wheeler name on it cast aside and a fist pound on the door. Didn't it sound good again to hear plain knuckles rap on the wood, and when she didn't answer that, a stick beat on the door. That wasn't a town body, Sayward told herself. No, such would have fretted she might be upstairs or sick. It would be a terrible hardship to rouse an ailing woman in her 80s and run her downstairs to the door her own self. But this rowdy body, whoever it was out there now, didn't care if she was up in years or not. He reckoned she could come to the door. By hokey day, she told herself, she would put on her shoes and see who this was that didn't think she ought to lay abed and have somebody wait on her. She opened the front door, and there standing looking up at her was a smiling young girl she ought to know, and a little old man with snow-white hair, red cheeks, and a cane. She reckoned she never saw him before. Now wait a minute. There was something familiar about those little bare eyes, and the small mouth, and face swollen around the cheeks. Then suddenly she knew who he looked like. It was old Judah, who died of a mad wolf bite way back when Resolve was only a whip of a boy. Alec McWhirter, what on earth? I thought you were dead and buried long ago up in Wisconsin, or wherever you went to. Come in, both of you, and to think I almost didn't go to the door. Oh, we'd gone around to the back if you didn't come to the front, he told her. And if you didn't come to the back, we'd come in and hollered. And if the door was locked, we'd gone to your neighbors to help rout you out. You wouldn't have got rid of us that easy. What a treat that had been for her to visit with Alec McWhirter, one of the few of her own kind left, you might say of her own family. Why, the McWhirters and the Covenhovens had been the closest to the Lucketts there was. The oldest settlers around here save themselves. All evening she and Alec talked of the old days. Hardly was Porteous decently asked about and buried till they were at it. She asked if he remembered the time his brother Dave's bare feet got cold and stepped in his granny's kettle of hominy to get them nice and warm, and Alec asked her if she recollected when Asha took her pap's saw up on the leaning elm and sawed off the branch she was setting on. Sayward minded him of the time Jep walked for miles in his sleep, scaring the wits out of some folks who reckoned him a spirit in his bedgown, and Alec told of the first time he ever tasted coffee. It was in a cup, he said, set in a bigger and flatter cup, and tasted like neither milk, nor mush, nor hominy. The tears ran down his face, he claimed, while he drank it. Oh, one thing that night led to another. She would tell one story, like the time Todd Wilder got mad at his wife for giving his red mittens to the Indians. Then he would come back with another, like the time Will Beagle drank her pokeberry juice. I can still mind it plain as day, Alec told her. We were all boys together. Your brother Wyatt told Will the pokeberry juice was wine, and Will drank it. Then Jake Tench told him it was dye, and of course it was. But Jake said it was pure poison. He said Will would be stiff as a frozen skunk in 2 hours by the clock. The only thing that could save him was hog fat. Now Will believed him, for everybody knew that hog fat was why a rattlesnake was no good against a hog. Well, sir, I don't know where you were at, Saird, but Jake fed him your hog fat. Why, it showed him where you kep it. Now Will hated fat, especially hog fat, and most of all when it was soft and slippery. He could hardly get one piece down, and then he hollered he couldn't look at a second piece. But Jake gave him no rest. He said, Do you want to die and be buried in all this sloppy weather? Till it was over, Will was sick as a dog, puking in the grass. But do you reckon Jake would let him be? No, he had to get one more piece down to live. Every time it was just one more piece. Sayward could still see Alec sitting there a-telling it with his small mouth, and swollen around the red cheeks. His little bare eyes would look at her fierce, then his face would crease and his throat give out such a yell of laughter that his grand-niece would jump. No, they didn't do things by half in the old days. That little grand-niece of his must have reckoned they were both wild and crazy as wops. Only when it grew late and Alec got up to leave did they let themselves get serious. He stood there holding her hand, and neither knew if they'd ever see each other again. And then you could see it, for the first time, in his eyes. Folks loved each other then, Saird, he said sober. It ain't like now. Pride and style have took the place of religion. You may go where you will, you'll have a hard time finding folks like when we were young. Not around here, anyways, Sayward agreed. A good many asked me lately about those days. How was it on the frontier, they say. To hear them talk, you'd reckon our life was terrible, something flesh and blood couldn't put up with. They say, but didn't you have a hard time? And I reckon we did. But gladly would I live it all over again, Alec, if I ever got the chance. If I was young and there was such a place, that's where I'd go to. Yes, that had been such a nice visit from Alec. He had sat right over there on that hickory chair, laughing fit to kill. Hardly a year ago it had been, or was it 2? And now he was gone like the rest, those red cheeks of his in the grave. Sayward heard some whistling boy go by out in the square. When he passed, the stillness settled over the house again, like the tomb. It seemed like she had lived a long time, longer than anybody that ever lived, and all those days back in her youth were like the time of Greece and Rome that her young ones used to write school papers about. She could recollect how dead those days from Resolve's history books used to seem, like they'd never really been. Well, that's the way her and Alec McWhirter's early days must seem to young folks today. She picked up her lamp to go to the library. She had promised young Monroe Cottle to set down her accounts every day before she forgot them. Now, what was she standing here in the hall for, and what was she a-listening to? For a while she didn't know. Then she heard it again, and it took her back to the deep woods. Why, it sounded like the wind in the great white oak at the McWhirters'. Judah had left it stand over their log house, and when you went there, you could hear the air draw through. She could still see that monster tree in her mind as it looked when she and Porteous would go to call. The McWhirters' house was 2 stories, but it looked like a child's playhouse under that white oak. Some folks claimed it would draw lightning, but it never did. Old General Washington, Cora used to call it. Well, it was too far over to the McWhirters. What she heard must be from the sugar maples, standing by Porteous's log academy. Where was Porteous tonight, and why wasn't he home yet? She went to the kitchen and took her old shawl from the back of the settee. Out in the faint moonlight she stood a little confused and uncertain. Why, what were all these buildings looming up yonder? She had looked for black woods arising against the sky, but the only trees she could make out were these few in her side yard. She went up to them, squinting and peering. Why, they weren't wild trees or first growth at all. They'd be no more than stepchildren to those big butts she was looking for. Then her eyes made out her own stable, and she felt shamed. Why, that stable wasn't here or hardly anything else when the academy stood. No, she recollected now. The academy wasn't up here at all. It was down near the cabin where they used to live. This was her and Porteous's mansion house she was at, and these trees out here were the ones she had planted her own self, so it wouldn't look so naked and bare. Porteous was dead now, and all those old-time trees she remembered had been cut down and burnt up long ago. The big white oak at the McWhirters', the twin walnuts of the Covenhovens, and the sugar maples by the academy. All that was left around here today was poor and spindly second growth. Now, what was she so hard on these young trees of hers for? She hadn't meant to be. Her mind had just slipped a little. It wasn't their fault they weren't any bigger, that they were town trees instead of wild butts. They couldn't help being mild and tame any more than humans could today. Wasn't it Chauncey or Porteous who said once that present-day folks could cut down the woods and break in new land if they had to, but they didn't have to? That was the trouble. When natural hardships petered out, the government ought to set up some handmade hardships for the younger generation to practice on. No, she couldn't blame these young trees of hers. They did uncommon well since they were planted, sometimes at night, especially when there was no moon. She thought they changed into wild trees. Then they looked mighty tall. They stood like Indian chiefs, letting the dark come over them, like this was still their land and they were the masters of it, like they hadn't lost heart. Oh, she had to admire their spunk and feel for them. 3 young forest trees against a whole city. Sometimes she wished she could give them back their land, for it was she who had taken it from them. But all she could do now was save them from their enemies. Whoever had his eyes on this lot when she died expected first to cut down these trees and build. He'd have a jolt when her will was read that the lot could only be leased. The trees would have to stand unharmed. Resolve hadn't liked to set that down. He acted like she sided with these trees against her own children, for how could they get the full value of the lot if the buyer couldn't chop down the trees? All this time Sayward puttered around, patting and talking to her basswood, maple, and whitewood poplar. They needn't worry, she told them. She'd look after them. Nobody with an axe or saw would come in to fetch them low. She had done enough of that her own self in her time. Oh, she hadn't dare be too sorry for what chopping she'd done. It had to be, she reckoned. No, it was something else of late made her feel that way toward the trees, although she couldn't say what it was. Now she better go in before Libby came along, or Harry drove by in his new buggy and caught her out in the night air. Besides, she had to get a mite of sleep. That painter fellow would be here with his brushes in the morning. She woke up before daylight, like usual, and went down to cook her breakfast. She thought she better eat a mite extra this morning to try to fill out her loose skin. She wouldn't like to show up on that painting looking poor as a shad. After breakfast, she fetched in her broom and dust rag. If any of her parlor was going to get in the picture, it had better be clean. Libby came about 9 and made a fuss that her mother wasn't dressed. She took her upstairs and brushed her hair, putting it up to suit herself. Then she ran down to answer the knocker. The painter fellow was there when Sayward got down. He was a nice enough man with a brown goatee and a velvet corduroy coat to match. He bowed over her hand like an eat-frog feller. But before he straightened up, Sayward could see that his eyes were taking in her and the room. He told her just where to sit, with Porteous's bust in back of her on one side, and the painting of Porteous's grandfather on the other. Sayward said she didn't know as she liked that, having her likeness painted under one of the gentry, like he was somebody from her side of the house, when he wasn't. But the painter and Libby saw no harm in it. Once the artist went to his easel, Sayward felt rueful sitting there. She had never looked for them to do such a monster picture of her. Why, there was enough canvas there for a barn door. He'd have to draw her big as a cow. The painter's hand moved fast as his eyes. Whether he was drawing her natural or not, she couldn't tell, for the picture was turned away. Several times he had her move her chair, or hold her head just so. It was going to be a tedious job. Sayward saw a good deal worse than a tintype, but she stayed meek as she could, and did all they told her to, at least until they brought in the cushion. It was the painter who started it, although Libby was just as bad. He told Libby something, and she fetched the red velvet pillow from the blue brocaded stool. The painter said it was the very daddle. He laid it on the floor in front of Sayward's chair, and had her lift one foot on it, so her shoe showed outside her skirt. Now what's that for, she wanted to know. It's for composition, Miss Wheeler, the painter said. It's the fashion, Mamma, Libby told her. It makes you look ladylike and gentle. Libby should have known better than say that. Up to this time, Sayward had done everything they told her, though it meant feeling foolish and acting like a body in her second childhood. But now they had gone too far. This she would never submit to. Sit here for her picture, with her shoe resting in plain sight on a red velvet cushion, as if the floor wasn't good enough for her feet or anybody else's. Before she knew it, she had raised up and kicked that pillow out of the way, not caring if it knocked down the easel or not. Now, I've had enough of this, she said, heaving a little. If you want to draw me like I am, you can. If not, I'm going upstairs and take these Sabbath things off. That's all she said, but she could see her daughter and the painter fellow look at each other. Well, she told herself, when the painting went on, she didn't know as she had ever done that before, kick anything, let alone her own pillow. It must have been that business about the house yesterday, flying out of her at the same time as the pillow. Now that she had time to think on it, she didn't know as she would give in about the house either. No, they could wait for her to get out till they carried her out like they did Porteous. They shouldn't have to wait too long. Chapter 34. The Wood Cutter. The tree cast its shade upon all, even upon the woodcutter. Old proverb. Chauncey stood it as long as he could, but when they started auctioning off his faithful old Washington press, he turned his back and went to the window. That press had been his ally and friend. It had printed his burning words of liberty and equality, of progress and peace, and sent them across the country for all to read. Now the press was lost to him. The new Palladium was lost, and the work for peace was lost too. Outside the window he could see a regiment of Union troops. eager for glory and mad for death, marching down the street on their way to answer their backwoods president's war call. Why couldn't his unknown patron, he thought bitterly, have supported the cause a little longer? All he knew of that nameless subscriber was that he demanded a statement each month of the money Chauncey took in and spent. If his admirer had only waited a little while. Any day now Chauncey looked for his mother's death, and then there would be money to keep the paper going for years to come. That is, of course, if she gave him his rightful share of the estate. But would she ever do that? Sometimes he doubted it. He knew her and her practical kind too well. Likely he would have to use it for something a dead woman in her will approved. The most ironical of all was that now he had no further justification to stay away any more. He would have to go home and see her before she died. Libby had written him. Sooth and Massey had written him. Resolve had stopped in at the New Palladium office and abused him for staying away, as if he could drop his paper's fight for life and run whenever they whistled. Only last week Deasia had telegraphed him, but evidently his mother was living as yet, for no word had come of her death. How he hated death and dying. That's why he fought so bitterly against war. It was the horror of suffering, of wanton crippling, of gangrene and early extinction. Never would he forget the degradation of Rosa's youth in the grave. He stored with friends his few personal things, his precious file of the New Palladium he put in their attic. "I'll be back soon and start all over again," he promised them. "Meanwhile, I may write an answer to Uncle Tom's cabin." At the Americus railway station, nobody seemed to know him in his brown beard, for which he felt grateful. How huge his native city had grown, wandering these busy streets, among all the uncounted new buildings. He could hardly believe that here, as a small boy, he had been carried across the fields. As he approached the square, he felt the old telltale nearness of his mother's house come over him, that timid, helpless, and angry feeling in the face of his family's boundless strength and confidence, its great animal courage and decision. The square had changed. All was business now. Stores, offices, churches, a new courthouse, and this morning a cattle market, with steers and calves bawling, and the government buying horses for war and death. But his mother's house showed no change, as he knew it would not so long as she lived. There it stood, tall and deep, its faded red brick, its white lintels and steps, flaunting the uselessness of its old-fashioned side yard in the face of all the crowded progress. A maid he didn't know answered his mother's door. Then, at the sound of his voice, Libby came down the stairs. "It's about time," she said, as she coolly kissed him. "I came when I could," he told her with dignity, and after a moment, "How is everything?" carefully avoiding any reference to his mother. But Libby knew. Mother's just the same. There's no change. Harry says he never saw such an iron constitution. Thoughtfully, he hung up his hat and moved toward the library. "Then there's no hurry. I'll go up and talk to her after a while." "I'm afraid you won't talk to her after a while, or any other time," Libby told him in the library. "You're too late, Chauncey. I thought you said. She doesn't know anybody, not even Harry or Monda." Chauncey felt appalled, but it was swiftly followed by something like relief. "Then there's no need for me to go up at all, if she won't know me," he said, taking a free breath. "She might not know you, but you'll know her," Libby told him sharply. "You want to see your own mother, don't you? You feel a little grief for her dying, surely." "Certainly I do," he said warmly. "No, not exactly grief, perhaps. She wouldn't want my grief. She's had a long life, longer than you and I will likely ever see. She's also had a great deal more than she ever expected. She's never had much trouble. For instance, she's never been sold out by the sheriff like I just was. No, she wouldn't want me to grieve, and if I did, it would be over somebody who died young and unhappy, and had nothing but misery and degradation." He added bitterly. "Who's that?" Libby asked. "Your sister and mine." "Well, I must say you didn't act toward her like a sister." There they were, at it again, he told himself, before he was here 3 minutes, and after all these years. He felt the blood drain from his face, the old passion to be free of this house and these creatures of his own flesh who bullied and angered him. But he must remember he was no small boy now. He must move temperately to the hall and take his hat from the ugly old walnut octopus of a wall rack. Libby stood angry and formidable between him and the front door. "Oh, no, you don't, Chauncey. Not this time. You're the only one that's footloose. The rest of us have our families, except Deesia, and she has 2 weeks more of teaching. Huldah is on the ocean now. Can't you wait, for once in your life anyway, until they come? Don't you want to do a little something for your mother you haven't seen for 5 or 6 years? Or is it longer?" Chauncey felt echoes of the old childish sense of terror. "What could I do?" he stammered. "You don't need to do anything but live here in your own home. Hattie will get your meals, and Monda will look after Mama. The rest of us come every day and stay with her and help out as long as we can. But there ought to be a member of the family in the house with Mama all the time. Harry says you can never tell. She might go suddenly. She might get back her mind and speech for a minute beforehand. She might call for us. Then there'd be one of her children that could be at her bedside when she went." Chauncey felt the old sense of suffocation in his chest. Why, he hadn't had that since he was a boy. It showed how this house acted on him. He wanted to get away. Everything in him cried to escape while there was still time, but he was a grown man with a beard, an editor of some years. He couldn't run away like a child. He would stay then, he said with dignity, until Deesia came. To himself he added that he had nowhere else to stay or money to pay for lodgings until his mother died and he came into his own. He didn't mind it so much as he feared, especially while other members of the family were there. He liked best when the grandchildren came. Then he could even stand in the doorway of his mother's sick room untroubled by the silent shape in the bed, so long as they were about. It was at night when he minded it the most, or when he had been out for a breath of fresh air and came back. To enter the old house at such times was like Turning to the tomb, the musty smell of ancient carpets and hangings, the stillness and shadows on the stair, there was an air of decay and dissolution, of death and dying. He had begun to see now that the real corpse wouldn't be his mother. No, it would be the whole fabulous legend of pioneer days, on which he had been bred and raised. Then the legend had seemed heroic and very real, but today it had been moved into its proper perspective, and you could see that it had been only a dream, the self-made illusion of a rude and primitive race back there in the twilight of the forest. Somehow it seemed fitting now that before she died, his mother's lips had been closed. He and his younger generation must interpret her and her kind from this on, reconstruct her from their better knowledge. Surely he knew and understood her generation more clearly than that generation understood itself, the strong fare they lived on, their incredible epic tales like the nettle shirt and the buckskin pants, Gordon chopping off his finger, and the 2 Welsh children living through a wilderness winter alone. And so he listened with a polite but faintly mocking air to all those who came to ask how Miss Wheeler was, and stayed to tell him some memory they treasured of her, some trifling thing that had happened, perhaps far in the past, and that they had magnified into nobility and importance. Now that they knew he was there, the maid wouldn't satisfy them. Could I see Mr. Chauncey, they'd ask, or if he went to the door himself, aren't you Mr. Chauncey? And they'd go into a long story about his mother, making a great deal of some minor connection with this rich old woman dying in her landmark of a house. Sometimes even tears would come into their eyes. One woman with an old black cap and gray curls sticking out in front told how his mother had fed her father and mother when first they came through. That was before you were born, she said, and a stout, bare-headed woman from the country told how her mother had come to town one day when it was still Moonshine Church, and had been sheltered in the Wheeler house. Your father was away, and she slept with your mother that night. I often heard my mother tell how Miss Wheeler shared her bed with her. That was when you still lived down in the cabin. The callers weren't all women. A very black Negro with the whitest fleece told him of the time Miss Wheeler stood off the Kentucky sheriff and his posse, wouldn't let them lay foot on the steps of her house, where he lay trembling in the cellar, and a man with a green baize bag, who said he came only to ask how Miss Wheeler was today, insisted on coming in and sitting down, and telling a long story how when he was a young lawyer on his first big case he had complained to Chauncey's mother that Judge Wheeler was prejudiced and had ruled against him on every exception. Maybe he believes in your side, and is just doing that so he can decide for you later on. Then they can't say he favored you, Chauncey's mother said sagely. He claimed, and so it turned out. Even the girls, together with Manda and Harry, contributed to the myth. Manda said she asked if she wasn't scared of the rebellion, and Miss Wheeler said, why should she be? She was a war baby herself. born during the Revolution, but she didn't like Harry coming to see her every day with his doctor's bag. "You can't help me any more. What do you come so often for?" she complained. "I have to give Libby a daily bulletin," he defended himself. "People want to know how you are. In my day, there was no such thing as a daily bulletin," she told him bitterly. "You either got well or died right off, and that was an end to it." Even then, before she lost the power of speech, she had picked the text for her funeral sermon. It was from Luke. "Now let thy servant depart in peace," and that text had gone all over the city. But it was a dotty little old lady named Miss Jenkins who annoyed Chauncey the most. She sat a whole evening lecturing him like he was a small boy, telling him how his father was brilliant, but flighty and even queer, and if it hadn't been for his mother marrying and saving him, he'd have gone crazy and been plumb ruined when he was a solitary out in the woods. "What's more," she said, "your father was queer more or less all his life, and if he hadn't been for your mother to keep him on an even keel, he'd have never been a judge or amounted to anything." She fixed her pale blue eyes on him. "Aren't you the baby of the family? The one that writes? You ought to write a piece about your mother. You'll never find a truer body in this world to write about. I could tell you a lot, and so could some others. If you wasn't lazy, you could get up enough for a book, like the one they printed about General Harrison. He wasn't 1, 2, 3 with your mother. I'm sure a good many would want to read it, especially here in Shawnee County." Chauncey kept a cool silence. Miss Jenkins would be surprised, he thought, should he write a piece about his mother and interpret some of the things about her he knew. Those who praised her hospitality to the skies would be astounded to read that hospitality was a savage virtue, like Talleyrand said, and his mother was hospitable simply because all those years in the woods she suffered a need and thirst for human companionship that wouldn't be satisfied long after the need was filled. The Negro slave she saved from the sheriff would be startled and confused to hear that it wasn't Miss Wheeler's kindness of heart that had protected him from his owner so much as an inbred intolerance for others who believed in something she did not, such as slavery. All their lives the pioneers had to fight Indians, wild game, the trees, hardship, starvation, and it was this habitual contentiousness and resulting cruelty that had made his mother accustomed to and even eager for the horrors of war. Didn't he know, hadn't she refused to let her own sick son be taken to school in a carriage, but compelled him to walk every day to and fro, and the lawyer who believed her a sage would be confounded to learn how little she really knew of life and the world outside, how she couldn't even read or write until her own children taught her, and then her lips would move and hiss painfully, and while writing, her tongue twist and writhe in her mouth. He himself was surprised, when he started to think about it, how many stories and anecdotes about his mother there were, and how revealing their interpretation. There was one she liked to tell of the time Resolve was governor, and a French dignitary came to see him. "He's out on the farm," they told him, and then He's out in the field. The Frenchman went out and saw a man helping to cradle wheat. But I want to see the governor of the state, not a working man, he said. That's the governor, he was told. The French dignitary couldn't believe it, that the head of a great American state would work like a common man. When he found it was true, he couldn't get over it, and apparently neither could Resolve's mother. Sooth said she told the story at every opportunity, and Chauncey thought that both Sooth and her mother would be shocked to know that it wasn't the story and moral that made his mother repeat it so much as the impulse to remind her visitors and self that her son was governor, which made herself more in their eyes and her own. It was one thing for Chauncey to think this out and another to tell it to Resolve. He thought he told it amusingly, but his brother turned on him in anger. And the reason she kept your paper going all these years was so she could tell people she was the mother of an editor, I take it. I don't know what you mean. Chauncey was taken aback. She never paid me anything but her subscription. So you charged her even for that? I didn't charge her anything. She paid up her subscription years in advance, and that's the only money I ever saw from her. She fooled us too, Resolve said grimly. If you don't believe it, ask Monroe Cottle when he comes. She wouldn't trust me. She was afraid I'd tell the girls. So she gave the money to Monroe, and Monroe sent it to a Cincinnati lawyer named Hartzell, who gave it to you. She's also fixed it that once she dies, you can go on printing what you like as long as you live. Chauncey stood there thunderstruck. He wouldn't believe such a thing, that his cherished patron, his philanthropic and ardent reader, who had supported not only his paper but his own courage and spirit, was nobody save his own mother. His pride and world of achievement came crashing down around his ears. But no, it couldn't be. Why should she spend her money making it possible for him to say and print what he wanted? Things she didn't believe in, even attacks upon herself and her kind. Certainly he would never have done such a thing for anyone, and wasn't he far more progressive, enlightened, and humane than she? Despite himself, he found his steps drawn toward his mother's room. The sick smell, the solemn and gloomy air, the plain and ancient furnishings repelled him as formerly the dark wallpaper, the gray and red stripes of humble rag carpet on the floor, the rough table and bench that had been in the cabin. Here she had kept all these years the crude box for fixins that his Uncle Will had made for her out of rough hickory bark. It looked uncouth as the picture of her homely and beloved backwoods president standing on top of it. She had the picture faced toward her so she could see the ungainly face from the bed. This was the same cherry bed that she and his father had once slept in. Finer beds had come from his grandfather Wheeler's in Massachusetts, beds with tall polished posts and handsome canopies, but his mother always said she could never sleep well under frippery and vanity such as that. On the small pine table near the bed, he glimpsed his mother's large type Bible. Often, as a child, in the evening, he had seen her laboriously spelling her way through it. Today the book looked worn and singularly fat and flabby. It bothered him a little when he opened it and found it stuffed with familiar clippings. Her own hand must have cut them from the new Palladium. All poems, articles, and editorials he had written, even that savage piece attacking her and her generation she had saved. He winced now as he picked it up and read a few tattered lines. Could it be true, then, that she was the one who had kept the new Palladium going? He couldn't deny it any more, for in his heart he knew that it was just since his mother had been paralyzed that the mysterious money through Lawyer Hartzell had stopped coming. A strange, uneasy feeling ran over him. If he had been wrong about his mother in this, might he by any chance have been wrong in other things about her also? Could it be even faintly possible that the children of pioneers like himself, born under more benign conditions than their parents, hated them because they themselves were weaker, resented it when their parents expected them to be strong, and so invented all kinds of intricate reasoning to prove that their parents were tyrannical and cruel, their beliefs false and obsolete, and their accomplishments trifling? Never had his mother said that, but once long ago he had heard her mention, not in as many words, that the people were too weak to follow God today, that in the Bible God made strong demands on them for perfection, so the younger generation watered God down, made him impotent, and got up all kinds of reasons why they didn't have to follow him, but could go along their own way. Hardship and work, that's what his mother always harped on. Once when at home he had refused to work on the lot. She had said, "You're going to live longer than I do, Chauncey. Watch for all kinds of newfangled notions to take away folks' troubles without their having to work. That's what folks today want, and that's what will ruin them more than anything else." Could there be something, after all, in this hardship and work business? He pondered. He had thought hardship and work the symptoms of a pioneer era, things of the past. He believed that his generation had outlived and outlawed them, was creating a new life of comfort, ease, and peace, and yet war, the cruelest hardship of all, war between brothers, was on them today, like a madness. Did it mean that the need for strength and toughness was to be always with them, that the farther they advanced, the more brilliant and intelligent they became, the more terrible would be the hardship that descended upon them, and the more crying the need of hardihood to be saved? He had always felt a little scorn for those who came to ask his mother's opinion, especially grown men and women. Even his father used to do it, but now there were just one or two questions he wished he could put to her. Not that he would accept her answers as infallible or sage, no matter how matriarchal and wise she looked lying there. "Mama," he spoke to her aloud. She paid him no attention. He had half expected it, and yet at the experience, an incredulous, stunned emotion crept over him. Why, he was her favorite, her pet, they all claimed. Massey had written him once that if he only came home, it would make his mother well just to see him. Now here he was by her bed, and she took no more notice of him than a chair. Her mind's on another world, Monda said piously. Standing there, Chauncey observed that his mother's eyes continued to hang on some point off to the right, beyond the foot of her bed. He followed her gaze. All he could make out was the narrow bar of light from the window, where it had been opened perhaps a foot, and the shade lowered save for the same distance. "It's the trees," Monda told him. "We moved her bed when she first took sick. She wanted to see the trees." Again, that strange feeling ran over Chauncey. Why, she had always claimed how as a girl and young woman she had hated the trees. He remembered a dozen stories of her abhorrence and bitter enmity for what she called the big butts, and yet now all she lived for was the sight and sound of those green leaves moving outside her window. Was there something deeper and more mysterious in his mother's philosophy than he and his generation who knew so much had suspected? Something not simple but complex, something which held not only that hardship built happiness, but which somehow implied that hate built love and evil goodness. He bent closer to her. Something in him flinched at her face, shriveled as a mummy's, at the ancient brown skin marked with great purplish liver blotches. Were those blotches like her faults, he wondered, part of his mother's strength, like roughness and hardness are part of an oak, and if you take them out, you destroy the strength also? "Mamma," he called louder. There was no quiver of the eyelids. His mother only lay there, silent and oblivious as in the majesty of death. He knew now that she would never answer him again, that from this time on he would have to ponder his own questions and travel his way alone.